Hi everybody, thank you so much for all those who've attended today's opening and the panel discussion, and also to all those who've been following along online. I'm sorry I can't be there with you, but here's some information about my works which were selected for the show and what inspired them.
My name is Nicola Anthony and I'm a sculptor. My sculptures often take the form of text sculpture, which means that instead of using a line to create a swoop or a shape, I actually use a sentence. And sometimes instead of using colour or dots, I'm using letters. So creating shapes and images even with words, which will invite people to actually come in and look a bit closer at those stories.
Two of the works which were selected for this exhibition involve the stories of people who have had to cross borders, both mentally and physically, in their life journeys. In 2019, I did a project where I reached out to people across Ireland and also across the world to collect stories from those who have either migrated from Ireland to elsewhere to uproot themselves and resettle, or who have had to come from elsewhere and move to Ireland. So this involved economic migrants, it involved refugees, it involved asylum seekers, people living in direct provision, so many different types of stories and moving, whether through choice or not through choice, for many different reasons. The series of glass vessels on the table in the middle of the gallery is called Anthology of Displacement. It contains stories which I collected by going into direct provision centres in Ireland in 2019. For anyone outside of Ireland, direct provision is the system in which the asylum seekers are put. I met people in there who'd been living there for 10 years or more, and unfortunately the system has been criticised by human rights organisations as illegal, inhuman and degrading. So I definitely recommend reading up on this, reading those stories and finding the real truth, which is what I was doing through this project. These glass jars also have a kinetic element, and in a way I'm trying to think of how we are all trapped in our own worlds, but we're all trying to find our way through. We can see into other people's worlds, but sometimes it's just not possible to make that leap. The framed series of drawings which you can see is quite a different work. It's more abstract, and it came from a period of research during 2019 when I worked with isolated communities in Ireland, including adults with learning difficulties, migrant communities and rural communities. I started thinking about the Murmurations of Starlings, which you can see over the river here in Athlone, and at the time I was working in Wexford County and finding lots of murmurations of starlings there. And I began to see that what makes these starlings create the amazing choreographed patterns that they make is actually something called emergent behavior. And that behavior is just what happens as a knock-on effect, each bird responding to the one next to itself. So it's not through conscious thought or conscious choreography. And the same thing can happen in a swirl or a wave of water molecules, for example, or a shoal of fish. And this made me think about human society and how we're all just getting on with our day-to-day lives and not realising the rippling impact that has on everybody else. It also made me think about how when you are outside of a community and you look in at a group, you think, wow, they all know what they're doing, they know where they're going, they're all together, and you might feel quite isolated from that. So I became quite fascinated with this, and I started to make text drawings using letters, which kind of also emulate the shapes of the Murmurations of Starlings. The final artwork in the show is called Incubator. It's made of 200 burned drawings, each contained inside a circular capsule and tucked away in a special box. This artwork was made during the lockdown, at a time when people all over the world had put their life on hold, and I felt that the pent-up energy was building. I spoke to artists who found the lockdown caused an explosion of ideas for them because they had that time to themselves. Conversely, I spoke to artists who felt they had lost their mojo, and I discovered that for me, creativity truly does come from my soul, my heart, my humanity, or whatever you might choose to call it. And in times of anxiety, my unconscious reaction is to wrap that soul or that vulnerable bit in a kind of protective bubble wrap and not let it near the surface. Now, I don't think this is very useful in day-to-day life, but perhaps during a pandemic that was quite useful. But the effect on my artwork was that I couldn't really get to my true creative part. I couldn't really make work which was raw and which had the depth that I wanted. But meanwhile, in my day-to-day life, I was able to function. So I found that was a really interesting observation, and I wondered how many people go through that, not just in a lockdown, but in day-to-day life, without realising that sometimes when we feel numb, it's that protectiveness, and it means that there might be something that we need to address. I'm quite aware of it because, of course, as soon as I pick up my pencil and try to do a drawing, it becomes obvious to me. So I decided to document this time, not through keeping the drawings, but actually through a kind of catharsis of burning those drawings, but keeping the ashes. And I've noted down the circumstances in which I made each drawing. Although that was a time when my own borders got very constricted, I still think there's a hopefulness because I was looking towards a future filled with promise and a transforming society. So those ashes, and indeed each one of us, will still contain the trauma, the struggles, the failings. But one day those ashes have the ability to become useful again. And I thought that perhaps they could be transformed into clay or pigments, a new artwork, or take on a new shape and meaning.